Hello and welcome to our new chess tutorial. Today, I will try to explain some lines of fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann. Fantasy variation starts with f3. Now there is about 8 moves that black can play. Let's start with d takes e4 and f takes e4. Even though now white has the center, we can fight for it too with e5. The white can't take our pawn, as queen takes queen and it loses the castling rights. Because black now has some ideas of queen h4 check, knight f3 is supposed to be the best move. This also challenges our pawn. We now can respond in 3 different ways. Let's first look into e takes d4. Now white can respond with many moves, but only bishop c4 keeps its advantage. Black develops the knight and white castles. There is many possible moves at this point, but black will mostly develop with knight to d7, bishop to d6 and castles. If after e takes d4, queen takes, we simply exchange the queens and develop. Any e5 will be met with knight to d5, but most of the games here will end in a draw as there is no more queens. Instead of taking on d4, white can also choose to move bishop to g4 to create a pin on the white's knight. The most common move for white is still bishop to c4. This might create some sacrificing possibilities, because f7 pawn is weak. That's why black now must play knight d7. Taking on f3 would create some strategical opportunities for white. After knight d7, white castles. Now players just have to develop. So for example knight f6, c3, bishop d6. And now if white moves any of those bishops, or develops a knight, black will castle. This is already move 10 and there is too many moves for me to teach you about. If you are interested, check it out with the engine. Black can also play bishop e6. Knight can never take on e5 because of queen h4. White continues with c3, and now there is again too many moves to speak about each, so you should just follow the basic principles. Develop and castle. All the way back, instead of taking on e4, we can also just play e6, and according to the engines this is the best move, even though black remains passive. The game mostly continues with knight c3 or bishop e3. After knight c3, there is many moves, but let's say we continue with bishop b4, pinning the knight. White can answer in many ways, but bishop f4 is the most fighting. Players develop and black castles short, while white castles long. Now this is a perfectly playable position, with many attacking chances for both sides. In this position almost any move works for white, so if you are interested, please check it out with the engine. On move 3, g6 is also a good move. White will probably play knight c3 and try to castle queenside, while we will fianchetto our bishop and castle kingside. Black still has to be careful, and at any e5, we respond with f6 and then the knight will go to h6, from where it will later move to f5 or f7. Then there is many moves, but again the idea is to develop and castle. On g6, white can also respond with c3, but for the black everything is quite equal as if there was knight on c3. On move 3, we might also play e5. The engines don't like it, but after white takes e5, the black can swarm the diagonal with bishop c5 and later queen b6. So there is a quick line that might get you into a drawing position. After knight c3, queen b6, knight a4. Bishop f2 check, king e2, the only move, queen d4 and queens will get exchanged. But because black is slightly undeveloped, after few moves the engines like the white more, because of all the space and connected rooks. But if you are playing against a human, you will probably still be able to draw this. On move 3, queen b6 is also a good move. After knight c3, we can take on e4. But after bishop c4, taking on f3 would just help white develop and black is worse. So instead of taking, we play knight f6, now white takes e4 and we can strike with e5. If white takes on e5, the knight can jump to g4. White has to prevent the mate threat, so it plays queen e2. Now the knight can recapture the pawn on e5. Then bishop goes to b3. Some normal development follows and the white will castle long, while black will castle short. On move 3, knight f6 is also possible. After e5, knight f, d7 and f4 is the best. We may continue with c5, c3, c takes d, c takes d. And now after knight b6, bishop b5 check and knight c6. White can now develop as it wants, but best move is knight e2, and we respond with the a6. Bishop can retreat, but it's there to exchange itself, so it takes on c6 and pawn takes c6. After queen c2, I suggest you to respond with queen c7, while e6 might be too weakening. On move 3, you can also play knight d7. White has many moves, but best is e5, as it takes space. Now we break the center with c5. After f4, we take on d4 and knight will develop to f3. We play e6, knight takes d4 and then we develop our bishop to c5. After c3, queen b6 and h4. Then h5, knight a3 and black will have to stay comfortable with this bad b5 square. Black has to castle quick, so knight e7. Knight a b5 and castles. Then bishop d3, to launch an attack or sometimes to castle. Black has to play f6 and white will respond with queen h5. The only good move is g6 and the queen retreats. Now f takes e5 and f takes e5, and we gain this f-file. The position is equal if you are engine, but there are good chances for both teams as white hasn't yet castled. Your third move might also be c5. Engines don't like it and say that white is already a pawn up, but if you manage to exchange the queens fast enough, the doubled seed pawn will not make white any better. So for example, e takes d, knight f6, d takes c, knight takes d5, c4, knight b4, e3, queen exchange, knight c6, and you should be fine. So, this is all I can show in so short tutorial, but all these positions are quite rare, and I really suggest you to check some lines with the engine if you need some preparation. Thank you for everything. I hope you learned something new, and I will meet you in the next tutorial.